For the first time in history, researchers in China have successfully edited the human genome in an embryo.
It was announced that a Chinese team
from Sun Yat-sen University used a technique called CRISPR
to edit DNA in human embryos.
Is the opportunity to cure genetic diseases
and super soldiers for the military.
Consider all of the ethical and societal implications of a technology like this.
It's a way of hacking evolution itself.
Well, this is hugely controversial.
If they could figure it out with those embryos, what's to stop any of us from going further?
Biologists and bioethicists are sounding an alarm.
The scientists face accusations that they crossed an ethical line.
That this sort of thing could be sort of a slippery slope toward
designer babies.
Essentially genetically engineering the human race.
On today's episode of Attempting to Philosophize, we are taking on a huge mess of a debate. I'm your host, Nick On, and joining me today are three of my colleagues with particular knowledge about today's topic: Mackenzie, Sabrina, and Arpita. Today, we'll be fusing scientific queries with philosophical insight. I've gathered these experts here with me to dive into an issue that's really been popping up all over the bioethics and scientific communities: gene editing. In this episode, we explore the question of to what extent is somatic gene therapy and subsequent alteration of the human genome ethical, and when, if ever, does it result in a transition into an artificial version of humanity? Whew, that's a lot to unpack. So let's break this down. This question really revolves around the practice of gene editing. Gene editing is a deliberate alteration of the DNA so that it can be modified to create changes within a living organism. This was considered difficult and expensive to do, but with the invention of CRISPR in 1987, gene editing has become much easier.
And it was through our research to understand the activity of this protein Cas9 that we realized that we could harness its function as a genetic engineering technology, a way for scientists to delete or insert specific bits of DNA into cells with incredible precision that would offer opportunities to do things that really haven't been possible in the past.
This is a technology, it's for genome editing, and it's so versatile and so controversial, much faster than the regulatory mechanisms that govern it. Now, CRISPR has been the subject of just a huge media hype, and the words that are used most often are easy and cheap.
However, with this invention comes a whole host of other things we can do with editing genes, from treating diseases to modifying babies' genetic makeup before they are born. So to my guest here today, since CRISPR has so many applications, what are the distinctions between different types of gene editing? Is there one form we should focus on in investigating this idea of potential human artificiality?
Well, from a scientific perspective, it can be frustrating that the stance of the general public doesn't generally take the distinction between somatic cell and germline gene editing into consideration. There is a huge difference between the two that many people miss out on when creating their own opinions on the ethics of gene editing. For those who may be unfamiliar with these concepts, germ cells are cells directly associated with the passing down of genetic material. As such, changes to the genetic code in germline cells will get passed down to the next generation, while changes in somatic cells will not. Those changes only remain in the individual. Therefore, using CRISPR technology to change the genome of certain somatic cells will not result in changes in an individual's offspring. Because this debate is so multifaceted and complex though, I feel that it would be most conducive to only stick to one area of gene editing, somatic cell gene editing. This offers us a better critical site to focus on in inquiring into potential artificiality resulting from gene modification and the ethics of it all.
I agree, Sabrina. I think honing in on somatic cell gene editing will make this discussion more productive. But first, why is this issue a topic worthy of public discourse? Why should our listeners be concerned? Essentially, what is at stake?
Well, Nick, the ethics of somatic gene therapy and human gene alteration are, to be honest, kind of intense. At the root of this debate is a central concern for the natural essence of humanity. To be blunt, people are worried, and so am I. As technology continues to advance, specifically in regard to gene editing, concerns heighten over encroachment of artificiality into the human body. This worry is likely rooted in historical understandings of the human species and nature as such as pure and, quote, natural. In this sense, medicalization of the human body appears to the public as either defying the religious understanding of human as God-created being that should not be reprogrammed in a sense, or alternatively defying the more common conception of humans as, quote, naturally created beings. I've heard things like,
it's just, I tell you, this is me. I don't know if it's a religious thought or just the thought of a conservative person, but I mean, I grew up in the test tube baby era. I now know many wonderful adult, formerly test tube babies, and I remember being astonished that, no, so I don't know where the sacred begins and ends anymore on that particular turf.
and others have said,
And humans have ethically challenged God. Now, even people who claim to believe in God are supporting technologies that are basically sort of us trying to challenge the realm of God. And I'm concerned about the ethical dilemma in that. In the end, technology is not good or evil. It just is power. And it reveals your motives.
the idea of gene modification, publicly perceived as permanent modification, arises fear of bodily intrusion and artificiality. Beyond concerns for humanity in a strictly corporal sense, manipulation of the human body blurs the line between people and products, disconnecting us from ourselves as naturally created beings and the natural world around us. At what point will human beings be altered to the extent of alienation? From a philosophical perspective, I raise concern over interfering with the ontology of humanity. As we edit the genome, artificially modifying our genetic existence, what implications are there of consequently modifying human existence and ways of being? Nicholas Rose, a philosopher we are all familiar with, shares these same concerns.
Our technology, in particular advances in technology, are transforming who we are and what we can be as human beings.
Well, what about the unintended consequences of gene editing? Stephen Vogel, in his book Thinking Like a Mall, distinguishes between the natural versus artificial. Unlike many other philosophers who think human artifacts such as gene editing have no nature of their own, Vogel thinks that they should be considered at least somewhat natural because there are consequences from an artifact that can go beyond the builder's intent. For example, let's look at the creation of Facebook. Although it was constructed by a human, it can't be considered completely artificial because of all the results that Zuckerberg didn't anticipate, such as influencing elections and creating issues of cybersecurity. With Vogel's perspective, we shouldn't really be looking at what's artificial or natural with gene editing, because any artificial thing has some natural aspect to it, and thinking this way limits our perspective. In this sense, we should be looking at what the unintended consequences are that can arise from gene therapy to better understand the full impact of this practice, such as each generation of children being born facing genetic obsolescence and becoming yesterday's child, similar to how we treat so much technology today.
Yeah, Vogel really gives rise to this idea of unintended consequences, which I think is a really key thing to consider here. Beyond mere artificiality, the state of humanity as such is a huge ethical concern at stake. Global population is continually increasing, 7.7 billion and rising. Medical advancements that continue to prolong human life expectancy are arguably doing so at the expense of the planet and people alike. Earth cannot sustain an ever exponentially rising human population. There's already food shortages and resource scarcity across the globe, especially in developing nations. Editing the genome and possible future methods of prolonging human lifespans, as a result, requires consideration of the human population and our co-inhabitants on Earth. The planet can only take so much. These are the kinds of issues we're facing. Professor Russell Cutts from Oxford College of Emory University spoke with me about some of the issues he sees at stake here.
Another ethical issue that you don't hear much about, and again, this is like a minefield to even talk about, but take it for what it is. If we see rampant use of somatic therapies that are treating diseases, HIV, sickle cell, cancer, and if ultimately they sort of get naturally selected out of populations, then what do you think is going to happen to the average longevity, the average age at death for humans who have been availed of that technology over a period of some generations? Right? You can easily see that people are going to live far longer I mean, right now it's diabetes and cancer and, these diseases that weed us out the older we get. We have evolved to die at a certain age, and there might be sort of important evolutionary reasons for that, not the least of which is there's limited resources to feed our children. So what happens when the population goes from 7.5 billion to 25 billion because we're not dying from diseases of old age anymore? To me, that's an ethical question that has to be asked.
He also shared with me his thoughts about potential artificiality in human technology use.
I think that anything technological that we do is natural. I think that the real ethical questions are lying in the fact that even things that are natural can be ethically bad. Something being natural doesn't mean it's good or sustainable. And I think that that's really a more subtle, nuanced, and very important point about this kind of debate on gene editing.
This showcases a central debate in this issue. Can we say gene editing is artificial at all? Through an anthropological lens, human technology use could be seen simply as tool use. From this perspective, technology is a creation made by humans as natural beings, and use of this technology is a natural process and outcome. Opponents to artificiality will say,
and people that say it's not natural to change our DNA, I think there are a lot of medical breakthroughs that aren't really natural. A heart transplant certainly isn't natural, but if it saves someone's life, I think, and it's safe and it's proven to be effective, then why shouldn't we do that? And I think editing DNA is no different in that regard, but there are other issues that are true for other medicines that need to be considered, like access and inequality and things like that.
But I argue that there may be an important difference here to distinguish, even following the assumption that all human-made products are natural and thus technology is natural. To modify the body, despite this naturally created human technology, does this bodily modification in terms of gene editing create an artificial component in our existence? Maybe, considering that such modification is not evolutionarily produced, but rather intentionally caused by human science, there exists an element of artificiality. What do y'all think? Are our actions in essence natural, but we have the capacity through technology to create artificial components of humanity? And as Sabrina said, maybe we ought to focus on unintended consequences that can arise from gene therapy to question the possibility of artificiality.
Well, I think another component of this natural or artificial debate inevitably questions the morality behind humans' tendency to play God. People begin to ask questions like,
I don't know where the sacred begins and ends anymore.
As a species, humans are obsessed with attaining perfection, whatever that definition encompasses at the current moment. For example, plastic surgery and other similar technologies help those who can afford them live up to society's current beauty standards. We think that we are the most evolved species and capable of deciding the path of our own evolution, a type of hubris that is detrimental to the development of the overall species.
So, in general, we may say that the mere alteration of the corporal body is not something that is necessarily artificial, because everything that we do in our current bodies is still considered natural. But the distinction lies in the thought that these natural actions we take with gene editing technologies may carry with them artificial alterations in the metaphysical body and some more artificial social ramifications. We'll be back shortly after this commercial break to talk about philosophical works that tie in with this topic.
This podcast was brought to you by Blue Snowball Mics from the Oxford College of Emory Library. Special thanks to OCIT, the Oxford College Information Technology team, for bringing us quality sound equipment to record this soundbite on such an important topic facing modern-day society. Right now, get your Snowball mics for 30% off at a whopping price of $59.99. That's $18 off your online purchase with the promo code SNOW. Call 1-800-404-2317 for more information. That's 1-800-404-2317.
Welcome back. So while these considerations of the ramifications of gene editing are really interesting, how does philosophical literature tie in with this conversation?
Well, first off, Foucault is crucial here throughout this whole dialogue. If Foucault has taught us anything, it's that power and knowledge are always connected. Here you have the power and knowledge of gene editing as such, mixing with the power of those with the capital to influence science, those who are strategically positioned to exert wealth for social and political influence.
I think anytime there's a powerful technology that comes along, it often comes with both the opportunities to create great value and benefit, to society, but also risks. And I think that's true for CRISPR as well.
Because if you go back to the start of the scientific revolution, someone like Francis Bacon would say explicitly, like, science is going to be both about learning about how the world works and using that knowledge to control it.
And this power intrusion into the realm of genetic editing is predictable in Foucauldian paradigmatic thought.
Thinking about Foucault helps break down the ways in which we're crossing social and political lines here too. Developing gene-modifying technology that alters the human body opens the door to, for example, enhancing human capabilities such as producing super soldiers for the military. This undoubtedly yields political concern and social fear of militarization of the body itself through this technology. Things are getting really Foucauldian when we allow our political imagination to think about the consequences at stake with high-tech gene editing. This all just screams concern for manipulation and exploitation of intentionally crafted human bodies for the purposes of war, population control, or in general advancing particular political agendas. Like I said, the people versus products line is blurring. Humans as capital is scarily imaginable.
We have to also consider that the CRISPR technology can be used for things like enhancement. Imagine that we could try to engineer humans that have enhanced properties such as stronger bones or less susceptibility to cardiovascular disease, or even to have properties that we would consider maybe to be desirable, like a different eye color or to be taller, things like that. Designer humans, if you will. So genome engineered humans are not with us yet, but this is no longer science fiction. And this puts in front of all of us a huge responsibility to consider carefully both the unintended consequences as well as the intended impacts of a scientific breakthrough.
And as the scholar Michael Rice wrote in the Notre Dame Journal of Law, Ethics, and Public Policy, quote, "Be very suspicious about improving human nature, and be even more suspicious of those who think they know what improvements ought to be made," end quote.
Also, think of how this all connects to ontology. Foucault is really interested in how power and knowledge, as intrinsically bound, connect and act upon people and the self. Gene editing is a new form of subjectification, a scientific domination of personhood, both through gene editing and the scientific capacity to alter interior bodily components. Power plays a role in this possible artificiality. Foucault often refers to these forms of controlling forces as, quote, technologies of domination. This really highlights not only bodily domination and control, but gets into Foucault's ideas of focusing on how people's individual thoughts, feelings, and actions are controlled. For example, Sabrina mentioned earlier how gene editing holds the capacity to change beauty standards and alter social views of what is desirable. How do these kinds of alterations of perceived norms change your idea of freedom and even alter our views of the world?
Following some of Foucault's ideas, gene editing on a large scale could create a binding of humans and the technique of power with the tech of power. Ideas of state racism arise as we consider Foucault's argument that the state is, quote, obliged to use race, the elimination of races, and purification of the race to exercise its sovereign power.
Exactly, and consideration of health isn't really at stake here. I mean, yes, Foucault points out that allowing the death of the other, the bad race, the inferior race, in order to allow life for, quote, the good race to live is done so with the goal to, quote, make life in general healthier, end quote. But this healthy definition means health as being more pure, free of the defective, the inadequate race. As you can imagine, this is where the ethics at stake are now entirely thrown out the window for gene editing possibilities, and the notion of crafting a race, weeding out impurities, sounds like a design-your-own schema of humanity. I think most of us would agree that a customized race is, at the very least, somewhat artificial.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that, and also consider how this pervasive alteration would change conceptions of human existence and being. To bring it back to your point, Mackenzie, about ontology and phenomenology, can you expand a little more on these concepts? Thinking about Foucault, rules and regulations embedded into the population by gene editing would play a role in this paradigmatic shift.
Oh, absolutely. Think back to Foucault's proposition that there is an emergence of the, quote, power of regularization, or the technologies which predict or modify the, quote, series of random events that can occur in a living mass, end quote. In contrast to disciplinary technology, this new technology, quote, aims to establish a sort of homeostasis, not by training individuals, but by achieving an overall equilibrium that protects the security of the whole from internal dangers. This clearly gets heavily into the potential of racism with gene alteration, but furthermore displays how gene editing is a new form of regulatory power manifesting in CRISPR development. This power applied, quote, not to man as body, but to man as living being, end quote, is discipline that, to once more pull straight from Foucault, quote, tries to rule a multiplicity of men to the extent that the multiplicity can and must be dissolved into individual bodies that can be kept under surveillance, trained, used, and, if need be, punished, end quote. And so this new gene modification technology is addressed to all because they form a global mass affected by overall processes characteristic of birth, death, production, illness, and so on.
So essentially, this power as a regularization and disciplinary tool is a technology that dissolves the mass into controllable, producible, and usable beings. This possibility of programming bodies seems to alter the ontological experience and the phenomenology of humans as independent bodies. What we understand freedom to be is restructured, taking on new norms and modeled according to the new technology of regularization.
And as a result, there is a massive disruption in the ways of seeing ourselves and seeing those around us. For example, think about some uses of gene editing for population control. Gene editing to sterilize a germline for population regulation of specific races, for example, or to lower birth rates. Not only does this further progress the ontological shift in viewing people as bodies of product, made artificially and made to be used, but there's also an alteration in the self-perception of the value of one's body. New norms could emerge, fulfilling disciplinary goals and purposes, where we see our bodies as commodities in themselves. The common bodily perception could emerge to be that we conceptualize ourselves and others as minds separate from corporal selves. We may see corporality being separated as a product usually used for scientific or political benefit.
I could see these ideas intruding into the workforce. Human capability enhancement could be instituted to match and counter the rise of machines in non-specialized tasks, such as factory or construction jobs. Or think about gene editing to create specific super soldiers for the military. In both scenarios, the bodily existence and experience is altered to a more artificial one, as the natural connection between mind and body is complicated by technology.
And further spiraling out of this idea of human enhancement and ideas of so-called super soldiers comes fear of obsolescence, as we have briefly touched on, but I think this implication is worthy of more attention. Many molecular technologies have the attractive possibility to genetically enhance humans to produce those with beyond species typical traits. However, rapid development of technologies always brings about the problem of obsolescence. We see this with technologies we use every day, ranging from cars to phones. No one wants the older model, and if humans are produced as a sort of technology that can be advanced and improved upon, then each generation of children that are born will soon face genetic obsolescence and become yesterday's child. This conundrum would have many important social and philosophical implications for future generations. As German philosopher Habermas pointed out, genetic human enhancement would blur the line between people and product.
Exactly. And potentially we reach a threshold of people as products. This sort of commodification of the human body, reducing corporality to productivity, is the exact kind of thing Foucault has been warning about. This is a new technology wielding massive power, and it's bringing the potential of a paradigm shift. Gene editing practices could alter our view of humanity and individual views of the self. What defines a human, what ought to make up a human, and even what value does an individual hold.
These ideas really evoke potential sites of artificiality in gene editing, considering such outcomes that could displace and commodify human beings. And finally, what about the social ramifications for people who choose not to participate? What about those who aren't able to afford this technology due to class stratification? And also consider the potential for those of lower socioeconomic classes to even become targets of modification as exploitative, experimentative property. In one sense, there is concern for large portions of the population falling behind as technology inequitably benefits the elite. In the other, a technological genocide is at stake. Both raise flags of gene alteration, invoking an artificial element into only certain human bodies, displacing and disrupting the human body and the collective body.
Yeah, and for those who can't afford these technologies or refuse to participate in them, they might have several reasons for refusing. especially in the perspective of the natural versus artificial debate that we have been discussing. Another reason for this denial might be a simple refusal to take part in a system that could provide unfair advantages to individuals undeserving of them. Regardless of their intentions, those people would simply not be able to compete on a level playing field. Either way, those who don't have the privilege or the will to access gene editing would be left behind in this race for improvement.
That's fair. When thinking about ethics, we should be considering how the political and social climate in modern-day society, America in particular, would cause inequitable benefits from these new gene editing technologies. But I also don't feel like we should withhold these benefits just because it would increase the gap between people of different socioeconomic statuses. Yeah, I wish there were a way for the government to make the benefits of gene editing more widely available, despite the expensive nature of using this technology to boost human health, but that's a change that has to happen more fundamentally within the political realm. Just because we're not there right now, or yet, doesn't mean we should withhold the ability to. For example, cure people of cancer if that technology becomes available via gene editing. Science is often performed on principles of beneficence and non-maleficence. From that perspective, so long as a new technology, though powerful, is used to benefit people and not harm them, then I think it's okay.
You gotta start somewhere, and sometimes trial drugs also only benefit those who are able to afford them. But that doesn't mean the benefits don't then trickle down into the rest of the population after the drug has been approved. The co-founder of CRISPR also has some thoughts on equitability concerns with CRISPR.
You know, I think anytime there's a powerful technology that comes along, it often comes with both opportunities to create great value and benefit to society, but also risks. And I think that's true for CRISPR as well. I don't personally want to create a cure for genetic disease that's only affordable by the 0.001%.
Sabrina, you really seem to be grappling with some of these issues and trying to provoke us to go deeper. In my own thoughts exploring these ideas, I see all the issues surrounding us. But what can be done? Where can we go from here? But first, we'll be right back after a brief commercial break to discuss our final concluding thoughts on the ramifications of this rapidly advancing technology.
'Tis the season for a magical visit to the Disneyland Winter Wonderland Resort. Well, we've got 2 free tickets for the first person to call within the next 5 minutes and correctly answer our trivia question. Sponsored by the very generous Let's Give Students a Break Foundation, here's your question. In what year was the gene editing technology CRISPR invented? Call in now at 1-800-777-7777. That's 1-800-777-7777.
Welcome back to Attempting to Philosophize. So based on what we know about the ethical debate, where should we go from here? Let's give our listeners a taste of our personal input after such a complicated and difficult debate.
Nick, I think Sabrina really made a good point earlier that begins to address the big idea here. I really appreciate the distinction you made, Sabrina, between the social benefits of human health and the politics of it, sort of an individual versus population schema. As Sabrina said, yes, we cannot deny the health benefits here. CRISPR brings the possibility of curing disease, genetic disorders, or cancer. It's absolutely true that CRISPR can.
So once a double-stranded break is made in DNA, we can induce repair and thereby potentially achieve astounding things like being able to correct mutations that cause sickle cell anemia or cause Huntington's disease.
And, I've even heard incredible stories about the things that this technology can do.
There was a great story of some little girl who they saved from leukemia by taking the blood out, editing it, putting it back.
Regardless, at the same time, this technology is entering a political realm where scientific advancements are expensive and oftentimes propelled by direct or indirect connections to the ultimate goal of making money. The philosopher Nicholas Rose began to grapple with this tension between public health and political power in his work, The Politics of Life Itself. Rose wrote, quote, "Neither the production of truth nor the production of health is now sufficient to move the venture capitalists, patent offices, and science writers. Scientific inquiry and development must be legitimated by the logics of product development and market share," end quote. Others propose the same.
And because of the excitement around this technology, there's a lot of interest in startup companies that have been founded to commercialize the CRISPR technology, and lots of venture capitalists that have been investing in these companies.
So you can see how human health gets sidelined in favor of the most lucrative developments. This leads into fulfilling specific agendas. We see corporate and political power intruding into science for capital gain or power gain. For example, think about the Purdue Pharma scandal, where the company propelled the opioid epidemic by marketing OxyContin for capitalistic gains. To go back to Rose, he said, quote, "The politics of the life sciences, the politics of life itself, has been shaped by those who controlled the human, technical, and financial resources necessary to fund such endeavors." End quote. We have to derail the elite occupation of science and permitted intrusion by wealthy investors, swaying agendas, if we genuinely want to start to dismantle power systems and genetic modification.
The issue doesn't cease with our political and economic system, though. I think we must also question our legal framework and think about how the rise of genetic information fits into privacy and personal rights. Because genetic information is another source of power, as I'm sure we can all imagine, this sensitive information inevitably holds the potential to be commodified or exploited, and a host of personal privacy issues come into question. Belinda Bennett, who is a professor of health law at Queensland University of Technology, has a really interesting article on the changing dynamics of privacy law with the rise of genetic information. Her article, Genetics and the Transformation of the Personal, dissects this notion of changing meanings of privacy as genetic information is more prominent and accessible. In particular, she discusses concerns for the lack of control over, quote, the ways that our personal information is used, and more critically offers the idea of a transformation in the human personal identity and social relations with the rise of genetic information and gene editing. She poses the idea that gene alteration and privacy questions regarding genetic information is impacting, quote, contemporary understandings of the personal and the boundaries between us and others. Belinda specifically argues that the inherent relatedness of genetic information presents a fundamental shift in the conceptualization of the realm of the personal and of the self. Lack of legal protection denies genetic isolation and autonomy within this framework, creating a society of what Belinda describes as, quote, linked and tied to others in ways that can be complex, messy, and challenging. Belinda evokes the muted reality that the core premises and discourses of legal theory need reevaluation in response to this new position of the individual as a genetically relational and accessible being rather than as a private individual.
Nicholas Rose also touched on this idea, writing that, quote, the classical distinction between that which is not human, ownable, tradable, commodifiable, and that which is human, not legitimate material for such commodification, no longer seems so stable, end quote. Rose hits it right on the head. We have to address the lack of legislation to handle this new technology that intrudes into the body and potentially commodifies our corporeality. And in my opinion, a commodified corporeality seems pretty erosive to my natural existence as a naturally created being. Dismantling privacy and legal inadequacies, developing law alongside technological change might prevent previously discussed unintended consequences that encroach into artificiality. The co-founder of CRISPR feels the same.
I've been working on for several years with my colleagues to educate people about that possibility and to really welcome a global discussion about how to appropriately regulate this technology.
So we can see there's clear concerns for
about how to control and limit any kind of off-target or unintended effects of using the technology.
One question I've been thinking about throughout this whole discussion is how should society address gene alteration practices if such a scale of morality is credible regarding gene editing? Centering this ethical debate and bringing us back to the core dilemma here, let's focus on the good versus bad. But it's not so black and white, as we know. We ought to uptake a nuanced understanding of somatic cell gene modification as falling on a scale of morality of sorts, and on this scale, maybe somatic cell gene editing is more credible and less artificial. Michael Rice, a scholar I previously mentioned, offers a nuanced perspective on this idea. Rice, author of What Sort of People Do We Want? The Ethics of Changing People Through Genetic Engineering, poses varying degrees of problematic science and genetic engineering based on context and intent. For example, Rice poses that somatic gene therapy offers realistic possibility of relief from certain medical conditions and improving physical health, relieving stress, worry, and other psychological problems. He poses it is, quote, not significantly different from other medical treatments, end quote. Others pose the same.
I mean, a heart transplant certainly isn't natural, but if it saves someone's life, then why shouldn't we do that? I think editing DNA is no different in that regard.
But despite clear benefits, Rice nudges this notion of an ethical scale pertaining to gene editing.
That perfectly captures some of the complexities here. It is advantageous for some purposes, possibly alleviating suffering in certain circumstances, but context and intent easily institute a dichotomy. Curing diseases can quickly transform into enhancing human traits and crafting one's ideal population, a measure accurately depicted in Foucauldian terms as genetic biopolitics.
Yeah, and we're not falling down a slippery slope fallacy here. We have the ability to alter traits and literally create a customizable race. So we must institute insurance to prevent power from assuming this technology. As Rice's perspective evokes, genetic engineering is a highly controversial realm, yielding potential for good and the extremely bad. But technology that allows the question of what sort of people do we want to be posed and answered with the scientific prowess to actualize an imagined race necessitates grand responsibility. We have created this technology, and now we must recognize the responsibility at stake to institute regulation to prevent abuse and exploitation, to prevent artificializing the body for unethical or corrupt agendas.
Then I think we can agree that there is a huge need for politicians to step in and more critically review the nuances of somatic cell gene editing. But we must also consider the general public. We should aim at educating those who are still unfamiliar with this topic, as it's pretty complicated and science-heavy. Again, like the difficult topic of climate change, the scientific community needs to work on its science communication skills in a way that could allow the public to better understand such important societal issues, especially since it will very quickly pertain to them. Next, our political climate needs to get up to speed with the potential dangers and benefits associated with the power that lies in this new form of genetic technology. What role will the American government play, or even the UN, setting global ethical norms of conduct on this rapidly advancing technology? They need to consider already existing differences in economic privilege and how the widespread reliance on this technology may further exacerbate the gap between the rich and poor. And again, what about those who refuse to accept this technology for treatment because of religious or personal moral convictions? How will we be able to protect their rights?
Another action to consider in addressing this issue takes us back to the notion that all human action is, in essence, natural as a product of human beings. However, I think we've reached a consensus that despite the natural component of human technology use, humans have the capacity to institute artificial components into our bodies and our ways of being, such as disrupting the phenomenological experiences of humans by altering brain capacity. Going forward with this powerful technology, we must mitigate this potential large-scale disruption in the state of humanity. And I think that's all the time we have for today. Thank you everyone for being part of this episode of Gene Editing. We'd love to hear your own thoughts on this issue in the comments below. See you guys next time on Attempting to Philosophize.